Hey
Well,
Tom, how you doing?
hey, here's hoping that worked. I couldn't tell if you could see or hear me or not.
Yeah, I can see and hear you, so that works. So yeah, it's good to be able to talk to you. I mean, first of all, because I've actually wanted to have a debate with you for a while anyway, but also because I think it's better that we actually talk about this rather than just comment debating. Because comment debating is, I'm sure you've seen, everybody gets hurt. Nobody really gets helped by comment debating. So, but yeah, with regards to this topic about debate judgments. Um, the goal of having judges, to my knowledge, is to lend some level of objectivity to any debate that has gone on. Because we already have judges who are voting on pathos, the popular vote, which is voting entirely on pathos. Because the popular vote is almost always wrong. It's just voting for whoever your friend is, and usually your friend is the one who will convince you just because you believe your friend. Or they're just voting for the side that they already agreed with before the debate even started. That's actually part of the thing that Chaz was talking about when he wanted to create his just discussion about how debate is broken. And even the debaters oftentimes will go in without really trying to find an answer. They're just defending their own side, and they won't really look into any level of objectivity. But that's the whole point of having judges, is that the judges can provide some objective standards. And so the goal of that would be for them to determine which is the better case. And in order to do that, the best way to work on it would be to measure each side's arguments against each other. So if you're just measuring it off of the emotional appeals, then you're not really weighing the arguments. So I don't find pathos to be a standard on which to base arguments. And Ben actually talked about some of the problems that would come up if you start allowing judgment to be based on pathos. For one thing, the side that appeals to us emotionally is oftentimes the side that sounds and looks most like us. So an American judging an Australian would be biased against them. There's more likely that they will be emotionally connected to the arguments made by another American. An Australian judging an American would be the same way. This also means if we're judging off of pathos, whichever side is a more skilled speaker is probably going to impact you more emotionally. Whichever side is representing the side who you already agreed with in advance is the side who you're probably going to agree with more on pathos. So it just doesn't make sense for the judging to be based on pathos, which is why it really should be focused on the arguments that are made in the round, those specific arguments, and then the judges can weigh those arguments against each other. The first way we would do that is through the framework. So usually you'll see experienced debaters create a framework or a criteria or a value, just some sort of lens through which to view the round. And they'll tell you, okay, I want you to be looking at this mainly through a perspective of national security. So yeah, this is going to cost money. And so your opponent's going to bring up stuff about the economy. Oh, it's going to hurt the economy, or it's going to cost a lot of money, or whatever it'll be. But your main focus is national security. And so they're telling the judges, we want you to look this through a perspective of national security, or a framework of here are the three things I would need to prove in order to win this round. A more objective means of doing this, rather than just whichever side appeals to me emotionally is the side I'm going to vote for. So that's my overall mindset on this. What do you think?
All right. First of all, I'll start from, well, let's start from going way back, because to put this debate into perspective, the discussion that we're having here is literally as old as debate itself. Where basically you're taking the Platonic view. Plato, writing as Socrates, railed against the very concept of rhetoric, or what we now call debate, specifically because of the element of the emotional appeal. To debates of his, or the two dialogues that point out for your consideration and for the audiences are the Gorgias, which is a lesser known one, but is much more vitriolic towards rhetoric, and specifically towards the orator, for the very reasons that you bring up, and Protagoras, which is the better-known Platonic dialogue concerning rhetoric. I am more of the Aristotelian view, which has become the more dominant view of not just rhetoric, not just formal debate, but also communication studies in general. I'll be referencing several times here in this debate Aristotle's Rhetoric, or On Rhetoric. This is my academic copy. You can find it for free online several places, and I'll try to post a couple of links to different translations in the links. So the general objections that you've brought to the table do have foundation in these classical texts. The idea that if we just leave it up to the audience, to a popular audience, that it's going to be the more skilled speaker who will succeed, that the audience brings its biases, and also you've also alluded to this idyllic situation where we as the resident judges somehow bring some level of objectivity to the debate. Now, if by objectivity you mean that the people, especially resident judges on call-out, shouldn't let our own emotions be how we judge the better case made, the more skilled debater, you're absolutely correct. But when you're judging how someone uses audience appeals, you're not just judging how they reach you, but how they reach others. Now, in your argument, you used as a counterexample to the audience appeal the way that experienced debaters will set a perspective or a value, a lens through which they recommend that the audience views the debate. That is a pathos appeal. You specifically use the example of national security. If someone comes into a debate with a national security bent, that would be, in Aristotle's estimation, an example of appealing to the audience's fear. Now, when you're talking about fear, or when you're talking about appealing to emotions in general, the tendency is to think that you're appealing to irrationality. But as Aristotle points out, emotions in the audience very often have a grounding in rationality. Mm-hmm. And by appealing to those latent emotions, which are creatures of the rational brain, you stir the audience to action, not just to belief, but to action where you might otherwise not be able to do so. So when you say national security and I say fear, well, it's rational for an audience to be afraid of a terrorist attack, of an attack by a foreign power, or even domestic terrorism. In appealing to that fear, a debater can stir up the rational fear by bringing forward rational things that you should justifiably be afraid of. And that's a legitimate form of audience appeal. It doesn't mean that they're not making good points. In fact, it means that they're making better points by couching them in terms that are going to stir the audience not just to an A plus B equals C formal logic belief, but to an action. And so emotional appeals are an element of the better case because without those appeals, you're ignoring 1/3 of the rhetorical triangle, and in fact, the third that Aristotle believed was the most important, especially when you're talking about. He pointed out that in the case of politics and lawsuits in particular, he had 3 different occasions for rhetoric, and in those 2, you're trying to get people to make decisions, and to stir people towards decisions, you need to appeal to the emotions. One more thing I would say about us as judges is not like, we can't control the fact that pathos is part of the debate any more than the debaters or the audience can. If we were to say we're going to completely ignore anything that a debater does to draw on an emotional appeal, we would be doing a horrible disservice to the debaters, especially the ones who use in an effective way and thereby either win the votes of the audience members who either are on the fence or already agree with them or disagree with them, but who stir up the decision even to cast the vote in the first place. Just because someone has a latent belief on the site doesn't mean that they're going to automatically be stirred towards pressing that button in favor of one debater or another if they're not somehow persuaded even to act on their existing emotions. And for us as judges to say, well, we're going to completely ignore whenever somebody does that well, that would be a horrible disservice not just to the debaters, but to the site itself. I'll pass back to you and for your commentary on what I've opened with.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I've always appreciated about you, and one of the reasons I did want to have a debate with you eventually, was I love how you always bring a historical perspective to any discussion that you have. I think it's really interesting, and it gives a good groundwork for what you're going into. I during high school was part of a Great Books Academy because I was homeschooled, and so we would do online learning and we would read the great books. So when you refer me to rhetoric and stuff like that, I've read most of those because that was part of my schooling. And I would agree with you that this is an age-old debate, but it's also not entirely the same debate that I would say you and I are having here, because we're not discussing as much whether or not one should use pathos. We're not discussing whether or not one should use rhetoric. We're discussing when someone judges, what is the best means for them to judge off of. And I would say that we should be aware of pathos, and we should allow pathos to be part of the argumentation, but that when we create a judgment, it should not be based off of pathos. As you yourself said, that's only 1/3 of the rhetorical triangle. So if we are basing a judgment off of pathos, we're only focusing on 1/3 of the rhetorical triangle there, which would not be a good basis for a judgment. Now, you talked about how it was kind of an idyllic idea that we would not let emotion appeal to us. Well, my response would simply be that there can be some emotion that can appeal to us. I would give the example, since Liam commented. There was a debate that Liam had with Michael Tant, where Michael talked about how there were children who were being raped and murdered, and how if we were to let them back out onto the rapist murderers back out on the streets, we'd be responsible for the children potentially being raped and murdered again. And I was emotionally invested in that argument, and I ended up voting for him on that argument because I thought it was a great argument. But I didn't vote for him based on the fact that he had better pathos than Liam. I voted for him based on the fact that that argument was a better argument. And part of the communication style that he used was to correctly utilize pathos to make that argument more convincing. But I didn't vote just on, oh, he used his opponent. Pathos, right? So he wins. Because when this argument is matched up against his opponent's response, I felt his argument was very convincing. I'm not saying we should disregard pathos. We do need to include pathos in our considerations of a round, but we shouldn't vote simply based on pathos. And then you talk about how national security would be pathos as well. Yeah, well, but not enough to base a judgment off of. We don't just go, okay, one side said national security. I'd be scared if we lost national security. Therefore, I vote for that side. We weigh the arguments. We say, okay, one side says national security will be helped, but the other side says we're going to lose 50 million lives from Jamaica. So even though the United States might be more safe, if that requires killing 50 million Jamaicans, Well, the logical answer here would be you do not kill the 50 million Jamaicans. And then you can make an emotional appeal to this as well. Like, hey, we're not just talking about American lives. We're talking about all lives. And if we are responsible for murdering individual human beings in Jamaica, it doesn't matter if they're just in Jamaica or if they're in America. We do not allow for that violation of human life. So it's a combination of the argument and the emotional appeal. So it's not, we don't just vote on the emotional appeal. We don't just vote on the pathos. Then we have, you said that emotions have grounding in rationality. I agree. They do have grounding in rationality. I'm not saying discount emotion at all. We should be aware of our emotions, but we can't. Connection. Can you hear me? You there? Tom, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. I lost about the last minute of what you were saying, starting after your analogy of American national security to Jamaican deaths.
Okay, yeah. So what I was saying there was simply that we shouldn't base our judgments off of pathos. That we should be aware of the law and how that will be emotionally devastating to people, and how that should tie back to our emotions. We should feel upset that 50 million people could be hurt. That's horrifying. Just vote on, for instance, that same. If I was to make an argument that 50 million Jamaicans are going to be killed, and then for the next 20 minutes, I argue about, yeah, but 50 million people, it's terrible. And yet my argument is ridiculous because I'm saying that funding a space station will lead to 50 million Jamaican deaths. It doesn't matter how emotionally convincing I might be if the argument itself isn't good enough. So we still have to weigh one argument against another and then be aware of the emotions, but not vote just on those emotions. Then you said that emotions have grounding in rationality. I agree. And we should be aware of this, and we should include the emotions and understand that they are important. Like the one I had with where I watched Michael and Liam. I do feel like it was reasonable of me to say, wow, there are children who could be raped and murdered, and that does emotionally impact me. And I think that is a convincing point. But it's not just the emotion on its own. It's not basing an emotion or a judgment off of the pathos. It's off of the said that emotional appeals are an element of an effective case. I would agree. And once again, but it's not judgment off of part of it. That's why it's the rhetorical triangle. All three elements must be part of it. You must have good arguments. You must establish logical credibility, which is where I think evidence often comes in because it helps to establish credibility. And you must establish an emotional connection with your audience. But you can't have just one. Just because you say, oh, I am a researcher, doesn't mean you have the best research. Just because, so logos, you can't just win on logos. On ethos. Logos, you can't win just on logos. Just because you have a good argument doesn't mean you're going to win on its own. And you can't win just on pathos. So this is where my criticism of your decision was that it seemed like you were voting solely on pathos because you didn't analyze any of the debaters' arguments, even though there were a lot of them on both sides, and yet you didn't really bring any of them up. What you were really focusing on was, okay, this is how this emotionally impacted what was it? I felt like it was a straw man, but it was you created a hypothetical, sympathetic guy, you called it, sympathetic guy. And that it was just about how that sympathetic guy you felt emotionally towards as the debate went on. And then ultimately your decision was, okay, Khan says that Pro is a sexist and that he's defending sexist things, and you didn't agree with her that that was the case, but then he said something that seemed sexist, and then you voted for her, which...
I'll let people watch and judge for themselves what I actually said.
Sure. I mean, you can go ahead and explain what your decision was.
Said pretty badly, and I don't appreciate it, to be honest. I made it pretty clear. You probably can't see them because of the light, but I have about 8 pages worth of written notes on that debate on my iPad. As I said, when it came to the straight argumentation, I thought it was a wash. So, and then I review your feedback for the debaters, found that a lot of what you had to say would have, even though we came to opposite conclusions in the end, was duplicitous of what I would have said. So instead, I took the opportunity, because we had more judges commenting in that particular debate, to focus on something I don't often get to spend the full 7 minutes on, and something which I believe is underappreciated, which is why we're here right now. But if you go back over any of my other debate judgments, pathos always comes up, audience appeal always comes up. And in fact, if you had listened closely to what I actually said, I admitted pretty early on in my analysis that Kahn's specific emotional appeal did not appeal to me specifically. In fact, that I found it that it repelled me. I softened my language, because what I actually wanted to use stronger language about how it made me personally feel, but that it wasn't ultimately relevant to my judgment, because what I ultimately judged on was how it applied to the audience as a whole. Now, getting back to one of your examples, this comparative example of appealing to I guess American national security versus appealing to the security of people elsewhere in the world. Well, obviously, there's 2 sides of a coin to that. There's a logical side, and there's a pathological side, an emotional side. So you're correct. It's never going to be just one element. Mm-hmm. And I would never suggest that is just one thing. If anything, on this site, the element of the rhetorical triangle that gets thrown out more, and that I purposefully talk about a lot less than I normally would, is ethos, just because we are limited in what we can do presentation-wise and in building up our characters. We don't lead off our debates with our personal resumes. We're all mostly using casual equipment, sitting in front of our computers or in front of our phones. That's the nature of the site. So I tend not to talk ethos very much, because one of the purposes of the site, I think, is to level that particular playing ground. But pathos, anybody can appeal well to emotion just with the words that are coming out of their mouths, and not having to, show pictures of dead puppies or whatever, or, since we're singling out Liam, I believe once he accused me of supporting cattle rape. That was a fun, and I would give him credit for it, because a lot of the audience that he was addressing to is either vegetarian or vegan, or at the very least has ethical concerns towards the needs of animals. So using that piece of audience appeal, I would score him pretty highly on that as a judge, even though it repelled me pretty badly as somebody who likes to eat meat. So there's an example of a place where I think as judges we can say this was an effective emotional appeal for a large portion of the audience that is going to be coming to this site. Understanding the audience that is coming to QallOut is, to me, an element of judging how well one's presenting one's arguments. In terms of both, what logical appeals are going to draw them in, and also where are they already emotionally. This site is more friendly towards libertarian or socially permissive arguments than your audience would be in general, because we skew young and we skew towards what you would call the internet crowd. I don't want to say non-traditionalists, but
It's a debate.
just people who are more.
How many people are on a debate site?
Well, but you'll find other sites out there that at least purport to be debate sites that have, a more of a political homogeny that goes somewhere else. You can find Christian debate sites, and there, if you were judging a debate there, you'd say, well, how does this appeal to the Christian ethos? Here, even among those of us who are people of faith, there's sort of a diversity ethos. You're not going to get away with arguments that appeal just to the Christian emotional mindset. For instance, you would have to judge an argument on this site based on how do you appeal toward the humanist mindset. So, you say you can't have just one. That's pretty obvious to me. What started this whole discussion, to me, it's the limitation of that 7-minute video. To me, there's no way that a person who is judging a debate on this site and who's trying to give their complete judgment can do so in 7 minutes. So I usually have to devote 30 to 45 minutes just to recording something in order to get out in 7 minutes enough of a summation of what I need to get out. And usually I'm doing that solo. So when I see a debate where there's going to be at least 3 judges involved, that's where I said this is a chance for me to expound more on something I would usually have to can into this tiny space where the feedback would not really even be meaningful. Now, that said, let's talk about more in particular, because this was something that was brought up in the group on Facebook, these debate topics that are about dating, love, romance, sex, social mores, social norms, acceptable social behavior. If anything, I think we should be judging those on effective use of emotional appeals more than straight logical appeals. Because how much logic can there really be when you're talking about something that is that individualized? I've tried to give points on those sorts of debates in the past where people have brought, social science data, and even in the debate where that we're talking about here, Khan did have a couple of pieces of social science data points, but at the end of the day, when you're saying what are the strongest pieces of case for in that sort of argument, it's what can you say that's going to maximize the dignity of the largest part of your audience, for instance. Recognize the maybe not egalitarian values. I guess you would pretty much have to say that. What arguments are out there that make the most members of the audience feel like they have a say or they have a choice? Those are audience appeal questions. And when you say audience, you're not necessarily just talking about the call-out audience. I think that's worth considering. The same way that you would judge a lawyer on how well he addresses the formality of the court or the personhood of a judge, versus how you would judge a town crier on how well did he appeal to the maddened crowd or the people who are already ready to be spurred to action, versus, say, the beat poet who's addressing the crowd that expects to hear something that is not necessarily an A to B to C flow, but who wants to hear an artistic expression. So when you're looking at those debates where your audience is people who are in the setting of what am I allowed to do on a first date according to this debater, then that should come into consideration. How are you appealing to that audience the best? And that's what I was trying to do. So, for instance, as I said, when you have the con comes in with a sort of a screed about how it's the woman's date and the women aren't going to take this anymore, then you judge that saying, well, yeah, you've got the women and you've got a certain segment of the men, but what did you just do to another segment of your female audience? And what did you just do to the men who didn't see this coming? And vice versa on the other side. I kind of got off there because I was watching you kind of flicker back and forth.
Yeah, I think I'm back. So
let me hand most of the rest of the time to you. I hope you at least caught most of my rambling there so that we can still have a dialogue. But I was trying to cover because I didn't know if you were there or not.
Yeah. You can hear me. It seemed like my connection had cut in and out, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So the first thing that you had talked about there was you talked about how when you judged the round. First of all, let me say I don't mean to be rude in how I respond to your judgment. I found it to be problematic, but I don't want to come across as disrespectful to you, because I know that you put a lot of time into that decision and into other decisions as well. And I appreciate you showing that you had multiple pages of evidence. I find the same thing when I judge a round. I literally take hours watching and rewatching the debate and then giving a conclusion based on how I think that the arguments stack up. But that was where I had a bit of a complaint on yours, is it seemed like you weren't as much judging on how the arguments stacked up, because in your video you hadn't explained at first that you had these 8 pages of evidence, and then even in your explanations of that video, it did seem like you were primarily focusing just on the appeals to pathos, which was the criticism that both Benz and Liam and myself kind of had on that. That you were primarily basing it from what you were explaining to us, at least. You were primarily basing it on, okay, this was how it would appeal to the emotions and how it would appeal to the audience. Now, I get, as you explain it now, and as your first response back then did say, you were 50-50, right, on the arguments? Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay.
They more or less canceled each other out, and Let me throw this also in there. Something that was repeated. I don't remember which one of you said it, but something was said along the lines of, well, you didn't say anything about her argument on kindness. What kind of appeal is an appeal to kindness if it's not an appeal to audience emotion? You know, I was being asked as a judge, I believe the actual phraseology was, consider this through the lens of kindness towards one another. Both debaters used that at some point. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm being asked to judge which side is kinder. You guys saw that as an element of logic, like just pure logos, pure facts, it seemed like, and I don't understand that perspective. Clearly, it's trying to tell the audience what emotion to have about one side of the debate or the other. It's trying to appeal to a human value. So when it's that direct of an appeal to a human value, I don't see how it can be anything but an audience appeal or a pathos appeal.
Well, one of the things that debaters have often seen, and especially Emily, who used to do, it's literally called values debate, is that there is specific types of debate where you do focus primarily on values and on morals. And you also were talking about how you really wanted to talk about these moral topics and how moral topics you think should be valued more on emotional appeals and on pathos. Well, I don't agree with that.
I think they should be. I think it's almost a necessity. I would really like to see an approach to those that focused on hard social sciences. But in some cases, I don't know how much time two debaters can be expected to fill in that when there seems to be so much more persuasive meat if we allow them to go to the emotional side as well, or even primarily?
Well, I mean, I would agree. If you have these debates, should not have sex before marriage, a legitimate logical argument is, I did that. Not for me, and it was better. I mean, I enjoyed it. I mean, just say that. That's a personal appeal, but it's also accurate. And there's nothing wrong with emotional claims, and wrong with stating something that is an emotion or that is a value. Saying kindness, though, doesn't necessarily mean you're inviting the audience to suddenly judge the round off of emotions. You're saying, here is my rational argument, which is that we should be kind to each other. If you say we should be kind to each other, that's not an emotional statement. That's a logical statement, which there will be emotions involved in how one person is kind to each other. And that's why it should be part of the analysis. But that doesn't mean it's all of a sudden becomes primarily an emotional answer. If you say, what I got from Emily's point, he was looking for a world where the resolution would lead to increased kindness from one person to another in regard to the dating process, which I think is a valid point.
But both sides were doing that.
Yeah.
Is the thing.
Yeah, no,
but
that's why you weigh it off of which one more proved that.
But an element of the proof is, what do you consider to be kind in the aggregate, and that depends on your emotional state. Do you consider it to be kind for instance, is it a kind situation for the woman to get dinner paid with and the guy not to have food the next week? Was something that pro argued. On the con side, is it kind for a woman to think that she's going out with someone who can afford for dinner and then to find out that he's broke?
Yeah.
But you're appealing to two different you're appealing to the emotions of two different segments of the audience. One is a segment that values the honesty. One is a segment that values, I guess, egalitarian opportunity in dating. And which one you side with and which one you're convinced to side with is to me going to depend on how well those arguments are thrown at you emotionally. Now, to be clear, I thought that was a wash when I considered the emotional logic of that situation. That's why I came back to which sides. That's why I went to other values other than that particular one. But again, when you're being asked to judge what creates a kinder situation, it's naturally going to lean towards what does the audience feel kindest towards. Am I getting closer to showing you the marriage between the two things that we're saying?
Well, here's the thing. Neither of us would say that there's not a marriage between the two. There is a marriage between the two. And
what a bad time for you to freeze up.
Oh, you didn't see it? Okay. Can you hear me again?
Yeah. You cut out right at, here's the
Can you hear me again? Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay, so what I was going to answer to what you had just said there was, you were saying that you felt like the only way that a person could determine between
primary.
Okay, the primary way you could determine between two values is your own emotional status. But that's not necessarily the case. It's about which one would persuade you the most. For instance, in the examples that you talked about, if one side had shown that, okay, a guy being out of money is going to lead to the eventual breakdown of his family, it'll lead to abortions, it'll lead to I don't know what argument. You could make all sorts of arguments, and they could also tie in with emotions. And that's perfectly fine. It's okay to have arguments that tie in on emotions. But when we judge, we don't just judge off of the emotions. We don't judge primarily based on the emotions. We judge based on the argument. We can tie in how those arguments emotionally impacted us. but it's still supposed to be, okay, here was the argument made here, here was the argument made here. How do I weigh between the two of them? And part of that could tie in with how you were emotionally impacted, but you still should, in my opinion, determine which side made the better case. Not just by saying, okay, this is what most people would feel emotionally impacted by. And like when we talk about these moral topics, the ones about sex and about dating and stuff, that still doesn't open the door for us just to vote or primarily vote based on pathos or based on how most people would feel, because how most people would feel is often wrong and isn't often accurate. And so what we vote on is what each side has presented and how the arguments weigh up. Now, here's where I'm going to come back to your determination. If what you are saying is correct, that you did have a 50-50, you thought the arguments were a wash, then I think it's actually quite reasonable for you to have voted based on which one seemed to have, oh, did I go out? Can you see me?
No, we still got you.
Oh, still okay. But it seems reasonable to me that you would vote based on which one you think more impacted an audience, which argument would have made more sense to an audience, like as a tiebreaker. I get that. That's okay. But if we're saying accident, which is where I have a problem with, should primarily based on pathos. So more pathos. I think that is a bad idea. That's when you get into the issues that that's going to hurt us, because people aren't going to understand our accents, and they're not going to understand our ways of thinking as much. So if we're voting based on what the emotional impact is, well, that hurts them. And it also hurt Ben in that round on an emotional impact level, because Emily is a great speaker, and so she's able to have these emotional appeals to the audience, which Ben couldn't match, because, as he said, his brother was asleep in the same room. So he was.
I actually disagree pretty strongly with that. And you're talking about two different things. First of all, what you're talking about when it comes to presentation will be more properly classified as ethos. And as I said earlier in the discussion, we have to kind of equalize that in our minds because of the nature of the format, for the very reasons that you were pointing out. People aren't going to have equivalent equipment. People are going to be from different countries. People are going to be in different recording situations. But you can judge the emotional appeal just of the words and the arguments, not divorced from the speaker, because the speaker is the one, of course, constructing the argument and should be given credit for it, but without coloring it towards those other biases. I can't remember the exact line, but in that second chapter of On Rhetoric, when Aristotle starts to discuss emotion, he actually says things like scenery and dress and the height of the speaker and the surroundings, those sorts of things are separate considerations from what he defines as the ethos, the pathos, and the logos. And that's sort of how I try to approach it as well. It may just be because I was intentionally detoxifying myself of those differences, and I appreciate what you are saying about those two particular debaters, but I didn't see that much of a chasm between how they presented themselves when you took into consideration things like different when I say take into consideration, when you flushed out things like different national identities, different backgrounds, different appearances, different equipments. I've actually blasted the con side of that debate before for her choice of equipment, just because it makes it harder to hear her arguments. But those things that you're pointing out, I don't consider those to be part of pathos, of emotional appeal. When I'm judging what emotional appeals you're putting out there, I'm judging the words and how they are cast within the structure of your argument, and not just how the volume and the pace and how the person looks. Does that make sense?
To a certain extent, yes. But what you're describing as ethos isn't as much ethos, because pathos is the question of emotional appeal. So when someone makes that, they can tie into each other, but they're not the same thing at all. And so when someone is speaking in a way that is supposed to appeal to your emotions, that is pathos. and it really can't be defined as anything else because that's specifically what that is. Now, the reason that I'm just going to come back to this because there's 20 seconds now, is that when we're just determining how to have the most objective standard to judge a round off of, it can't be based on pathos. That can tie into how you weigh the arguments, but ultimately it does have to come down to how those arguments match up.
I agree.